This is actually a very difficult question to answer, so I'm going to start off with an example here. We have Polyglot A and Polyglot B. Both of them speak this number of languages, at least at intermediate level, and they have good pronunciation, prosody, and accents, and they can read all the languages. So what do these numbers mean in the following terms? Overall or total difficulty of learning this set of languages. The total lexical, phonetic, and grammatical knowledge acquired in the process. The language they've acquired helped learn other languages. First of all, we have to know what languages they speak to answer these questions. So the first issues you might think would be, language versus dialect, and lexical and grammatical similarities. Okay, so what's a dialect? What's a language? A language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So fundamental notions such as language and dialect are primarily social. So they depend on society in very crucial ways. Now, linguists do make a distinction between language and dialect based on the concept of mutual intelligibility. When there are two languages where speakers can understand each other, they are considered dialects of the same language. Okay, one problem with this concept, what does understand mean? It hasn't been operationalized yet. How do you do it? Well, we have the dialect continuum where speakers of A and B can speak together, and speakers of B and C can speak together, but A and C cannot. Czech and Slovak, they're often considered different languages, but they can understand each other for the most part. Serbian, Croatian now became two different languages. I have books to learn Serbo-Croatian. Have you ever seen a book to teach you Czech-Slovakian? Yes, there are. Oh, that's interesting. So now you have Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, Montenegrin. So you have to write it in three languages here, right? So, when we're looking at a list of languages spoken by a polyglot, it's important to consider the degree of mutual intelligibility. And that way we can judge the overall difficulty of the set in terms of acquisition. If there are two people who both speak 10 languages, that's quite ambiguous. That leads us to language difficulty. Which is harder, Polish or Spanish? Some people, oh yeah, it's objective, it's not subjective. Polish is harder. But it's easier for a Slovak learner, monolingual, to learn Polish. It's easier for a Portuguese speaker to learn Spanish than for a Slovak speaker. So it's obviously subjective. It depends on the languages you already know. In discussing the difficulty of a given language, there's always going to be very subjective factors. And the difficulty can depend greatly on the languages that one knows. The Defense Language Institute in California have different time frames for each language, but they're thinking in terms of a monolingual English speaker. For polyglots, it's a very different situation. It depends on your total language repertoire. For example, a native speaker of English who knows Japanese at a high level can learn Korean much easier than a monolingual English speaker. So it's not just what is your native language, but what languages do you know and how well do you know them? So let's divide the question into four areas: lexicon, phonetic system, grammar, and the writing system. So obviously learning languages that have MIDI cognates with languages you already know greatly facilitates passive recognition and acquisition. The first time I heard Slovak, I understood it. I talked to Slovaks. I use a mix between Serbian, Croatian, Polish mainly. Russian didn't help much. The very bottom there, if you didn't read that, you can see just a sentence, even in these four languages, how close it is, right? There are various sites where you can get data on lexical similarity. Lexical similarity of 1 is 100%, it's the same language, and 0 means no common words. This is from Ethnologue, and the way they calculate is they compare a standard set of word lists and counting those forms that show similarity in both form and meaning. But there are variations due to differing word lists. So, for example, lexical similarity between French and English is considerable in lexical fields relating to culture, whereas their similarity is smaller as far as basic function words, everyday words, are concerned. Another study estimates that the number of English words directly inherited from French at 41% and 15% of other English words derived from Latin, putting English-French lexical similarity around 56%. You can also go look at charts like this. It's quite interesting. I find the Slavic group the most interesting because there's so much interesting lexical similarity as you go from east to west and north to south. Now, this is important. Note that people do not have equal ability to understand cognates in other languages. It's a skill that you develop to higher levels as you learn more and more diverse languages. You start to recognize them. Polyglot A has 10 more languages, and then I gave Polyglot B 22, but strategically it has a lot of languages which will help acquire the other ones, and that's what I'm talking about here. Okay, 18 of A's languages are Slavic, only 4 in the case of B, but look at the 4 that B has. Russian, Polish, Croatian, Bulgarian. I throw Bulgarian in there because that's the oddball with the case, no case system, etc. As you see it turn blue here, these are the languages that Polyglot B is acquiring. And Polyglot B says, okay, I'm going to learn all these Slavic languages that Polyglot A has. This is a numbers game. They're in competition. Let me say I'm not into the numbers game. I love languages. I study languages because I want to use them to get to know different cultures, etc. But I often see this question come out about numbers, all right? So Polyglot B decides that it's going to increase, or she is going to increase her numbers. You can see, for example, with Croatian, you understand pretty well what's the other languages in the former Yugoslavia. And then Turkish will actually help with Bulgarian and Serbian. Then go to the Romance languages. Polyglot B has Spanish, French, and Romanian. Now it's picking up Portuguese and Galician and Catalan and Italian. And then going to Germanic, Polyglot B has English, German, Norwegian, Dutch, Afrikaans, Danish, Swedish start to become easier. Now that Polyglot B has just finished increasing its number, at least passive understanding, in all these new Slavic, Romance, and Germanic languages, HB is looking for new challenges. So all the languages I'm going to talk about now are not on Polyglot A's list. Polyglot A had 32, Polyglot B has 22, but all these other languages Polyglot A does not have. HB can use knowledge of Chinese, Mandarin, and Japanese to learn Cantonese, and then Vietnamese and Korean. So it's hard to pick a number. I would say that Vietnamese, Japanese, and Korean generally have maybe 50 to 60% of the vocabulary coming from Chinese. Here are some examples where you can see the words are quite similar. If you know how the characters change phonetically, it's better if you're coming from Cantonese than from Mandarin. When Polyglot B is going into Vietnamese and Korean, Polyglot B discovers that, okay, first of all, they are not mutually intelligible without study. It just shows where there's similarities and differences. Now let's move on to some other languages that Polyglot B has. So with Thai, Polyglot B is very good in Thai, can already communicate in Lao, Isan. And let's say that Polyglot B wants to expand his or her understanding of other related languages like Shan, Tayai. And Polyglot B speaks Indonesian, but regularly watches movies in Malay. Polyglot B speaks Hindi, so wants to learn the Pali because Polyglot B loves the Himalayas. Also for trekking the Himalayas using Tibetan to learn Sherpa in Tamang. If we're talking about greatly increasing numbers, which groups would you focus on? Definitely Slavic, but also Tibetan related. You can get around 30 languages from there. It depends what you call language or dialect, but if you use mutual intelligibility, definitely 30 or 40 languages. Tamangs don't understand Sherpas. When I was trekking just in February in the Solokhumba area, I was speaking Sherpa. There was a Tamang. He was going like this, and I told him in Tamang. The origins from Tibetan, so you see how things change, and the grammar is similar. Polyglot B speaks Tamil, so loves southern India, so can now speak Malayalam. Polyglot B speaks Turkish, and now wants to travel around Central Asia, which I did, by the way, going in the former Soviet Union, 1981. So I went to all these places that you see listed here. I didn't speak Turkish, I just spoke Russian to everybody. Polyglot B knows Farsi, so yeah, I can speak to Afghanis who speak Dari, and of course, Tajikis are basically speaking a certain form of Farsi. Let's go to the Bantu languages. So has Swahili and Zulu. That's one of the biggest group to get a lot of languages from. You can start from the north and go south. Now, let's go to the next issue, which is pronunciation, the phonetic system. First of all, we have to think in terms of the phoneme. It's a distinct unit of sound which creates different meaning. In order to understand various various variations in accents and pronunciation amongst our fellow speakers. In our mind, we have neural mappings and that subsume all related sounds that are not important in determining meanings. Okay, in other words, they are not phonemes. So gaining the ability to distinguish and produce sounds in new target language that do not have distinct equivalents in one's language is required. Okay, so it's increasing your phonetic repertoire. Now, there are such things called brain traps. For example, a violinist playing a violin all the time like this, the two fingers will start to stick together. When you try to move one, you move both at the same time. This happens when you don't differentiate in the movements. And it's the same with the sounds that you hear. They're not differentiated because the difference between these two sounds is not important in terms of meaning. All right, so since the basis of the problem is the absence of differentiation in the auditory cortex, you have to practice with exaggerated differences. It's possible to teach anyone to speak a second language without a foreign accent with proper training. You restructure your brain when you learn a total language. Quite interesting study that they looked at native Chinese speakers and Europeans who learn Chinese and those who don't speak Chinese. And the results identified two brain regions, first in the vicinity of the right anterior temporal lobe and the left insula, where speakers of Chinese had significantly greater gray and white matter density compared to those who didn't speak Chinese. Now, importantly, these effects were found both in native speakers and the European subjects who learn Chinese. Okay, so it develops. So I wasn't born that way. It's not ethnic. It's not. You don't have to do it as a child before you're 2 years old, or 5 years old, or 10 years old, or 20 years old, or 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old. You can do it in your 60s or 70s or 80s. It'll still happen. Not as easy at times, but it'll still happen. You have to put more effort. Phonetic difficulty is defined on the basis greatly depending on the diversity of languages that you already know. Acquiring ability in multiple diverse languages increases your repertoire of sounds. So you could argue that languages with greater phoneme variety, consonants, vowels, diphthongs, triphthongs, are more difficult in terms of pronunciation. But it's very hard to find how many there are in a language. For example, in English, I've seen a textbook in Japanese which shows 26 vowel sounds in English. And then some people say, no, there's 24, etc., etc. Here's just some examples, the total number of phonemes, including diphthongs in some languages in Europe. Here are some non-European languages. Notice Japanese at 24. Now, we also have to consider tonemes and chronemes. Okay, so toneme is tones. I would say the order of difficulty for me is Vietnamese, Thai, Lao, in Chinese. I would put Cantonese at the top, but when I speak Cantonese, my tones aren't very good. So it's more difficult, but I'm not very fluent in Cantonese. Okay, what about grammar? It's very subjective, depends on your experience. So I think it's a mistake to assume that languages that have a lot of inflections, like Slavic languages, Latin, etc., are inherently more difficult than those that don't have any. A well-known assumption is that all human languages are overall equally complex. Simplicity in one area would be balanced with complexity in another area. Okay, so case marking tends to correlate with flexible word order, and Indo-European languages have lost much of the case markings, like especially English, and have developed a more rigid word order, English versus Latin. So concerning total grammatical complexity, Hogan said, objective measurement is difficult, but impressionistically it would seem that the total grammatical complexity of any language, counting both morphology and syntax, is about the same, because they have the same job to do. What you don't do syntactically, you have to do morphologically. This is just an example of Chinese that doesn't have any inflections, but the word order becomes quite important, as well as the aspects in Chinese in order to express past tense, future, etc. Completeness, non-complete, on and on. Indonesian verbs also do not have tense, but they have a lot of prefixes, suffixes, and cofixes. All right, now writing system. So there's one fairly objective statement for this category, that Japanese and Chinese are the most difficult languages. Now, I argue Japanese is more difficult than Chinese. I studied Chinese literature in Japanese, okay? So I was learning both languages at the same time from 1981, because there's many more pronunciations of characters in Japanese. More variation. English is a crazy one. I would say it's one of the most difficult amongst Indo-European languages to write. Spanish is It's phonetic language, so it's written how it's pronounced. Slovak is too, very much so, but you have to learn a few things about soft consonants and such. Okay, so I'll move on to what is fluency. Fluency is a flow of speech. Fluent speech is smooth, forward-moving, unhesitant, effortless speech. A disfluency is any break in fluent speech, like stuttering. Some monolingual speakers are not fluent in the only language they know. In your native language or any language you know, can you talk about astrophysics? Are you fluent in economics? The next question is, so what about vocabulary? So a common question is, how much vocabulary do you need to become fluent in a language? Yeah, again, what domain are you going to be speaking about? Fluency is always domain specific. So it's quite possible to speak very fluently about a surprising number of everyday subjects, domains, with a vocabulary ranging from 1,000 to 2,000 words. If you run into somebody who has very good pronunciation, very good prosody, to such an extent that you don't know they're not a native speaker when they first start talking to you. They can talk about many things with a vocabulary of 2,000 words. This is what I found. It says, although an average adult native speaker has an active vocabulary of about 20,000 words, Reading Teacher's Book of Lists claims that the first 25 words are used in 33% of everyday writing. First 100 words in 50%, first 1,000 words in 89% of everyday writing. So it's been said that a vocabulary of just 3,000 words provides coverage for about 95% of common texts, such as news items, blogs, etc. Okay, so maybe we shouldn't say fluency, we'll say language proficiency. Another thing that people have an issue with is, do you speak like a native? Are you a native speaker? There's no single viable model of a native speaker. Monolinguals greatly vary in their ability, their vocabulary, their pronunciation, their adherence to standard grammar, eloquence, social pragmatics, etc. And a non-native speaker can potentially surpass many native speakers in various domains of target language. So if you ask me how many languages do I speak, here's my answer. First of all, I'm going to talk about passive and active knowledge, which is very important. First time that I heard Slovak, I understood almost all of it. Well, that's passive. But for somebody who doesn't speak any Slavic language, that's amazing. It's like, oh, you're almost perfect in Slovak. You understand everything they said there. Oh, you watched that movie, you read that book, you read that sign. Passive can be very important. So what I did here was I put in red, medium to high active knowledge and ability, and then blue, medium to high passive knowledge ability. The darker the color, the more ability. Green, some limited passive and active knowledge. In other words, I've dealt with it some in the past. I haven't used it that much. Thank you.
If you would like to know more about my experience over the past 5 decades, learning and using more than 30 languages around the globe, with adventures in 101 countries so far, then please visit my website, polyglotdreams.com. There you will find my memoir, A Life in 30 Languages, translated in various languages and integrated with audio and dual readers to offer a great way to improve your target languages.